They called him the Good Pope, John the 23rd, trailblazer with a sense of humor. A whole generation of young religious influenced by John Paul II. A guest house for Poles visiting Rome becomes a JP2 cultural center. And New York's Archbishop Timothy Cardinal Dolan reflects on two saints forever. Those stories and much more just ahead on EWTN's special edition of EWTN News Nightly for Saturday, April 26th, 2014. Greetings from the Vatican in Rome. I'm Brian Patrick, and we're now just hours away from the Divine Mercy Sunday Mass and canonizations of Blesseds John the 23rd and John Paul II here at St. Peter's Square. In the weeks leading up to this memorable weekend, you may have seen our special Saints for Today series, exploring the lives of our two newest saints. Well, on this eve of their canonizations, we thought it appropriate to revisit those stories as part of our special Two Saints Forever coverage. We begin with John the 23rd, the first pope that I remember from my own childhood, boldly setting a fresh course in the early 1960s.
This is Movie Time. Leslie Mitchell reporting.
Blessed Pope John Paul XXIII was born Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli in Sotto il Monte, Italy in 1881. He was ordained a priest in 1904 and became Pope in 1958 at age 76. That's the same age Pope Francis was when he was elected. Blessed John the 23rd was the first pope to bear the name John in 600 years. During his papacy, he spoke often about peace and issued the encyclical Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth. But he's probably best known for summoning the Second Vatican Council. The council reformed liturgy, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue. In his 1962 inaugural council address, John the 23rd made clear the council wasn't going to change doctrine, but to evangelize to the modern world. John the 23rd did keep some traditions alive. He wore the papal tiara and was carried in the ceremonial throne, as you see here. He was known for his humanity. In fact, he was given the nickname the Good Pope by the people. Another example, Blessed John Paul XXIII is a trailblazer. He will be canonized after only one miracle, not two, has been formally approved. I also talked via satellite from our Washington, D.C. studios with Hartford Archbishop Emeritus Daniel Cronin, who as a very young priest worked in the Vatican alongside John the 23rd. It's an honor and a blessing to be joined by Archbishop Emeritus Daniel Cronin of Hartford, Connecticut, who's joining us by satellite from Hartford. Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be with you, Brian.
You were one of the few English-speaking priests who worked alongside Blessed John the 23rd. You were a very young man at the time, in your mid-30s. What was that experience like for you?
Well, it was a tremendous honor to be with him on any occasion. Of course, my association with him was quite limited because I was the junior man. There were actually 4 priests in the section, the English language section, that had seniority over me, and particularly Monsignor Ryan, who had been Pope John's secretary when he was delegate in Turkey. So there was a very close bond between Pope John the 23rd and Monsignor Thomas Ryan, who was an Irishman actually, and he was eventually made Bishop of Clonfert in Ireland and died there.
Well, that was a very Italian Vatican at that time, so there were few of you who spoke English. Of course, Jackie Kennedy visited John the 23rd. I don't know if you recall that, although I do know that you did meet her eventually at the Vatican, didn't you?
Oh, yes, I did, and I probably was at that audience, but the translation would have been done by one of the senior monsignors from the section. At the time of the visit of Jacqueline Kennedy to Pope Paul VI, however, after the assassination of President Kennedy, I was very much in that audience, and I must say I was deeply impressed by the comportment of Mrs. Kennedy at that time. She had gone through this tragedy, and she was certainly a ladylike presence in the Vatican at that time, one who seemed to be able to rise to the occasion, and she was gracious with us all, met each one of us, and of course was very deferential to the Holy Father at the time, Pope Paul VI.
Archbishop Cronin, on Divine Mercy Sunday, April 27th, the Church will officially recognize that John the 23rd is in heaven with his canonization. How do you think you're going to feel on that day, having known John the 23rd?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's going to be extremely touching, because with John the 23rd as a saint in heaven, and indeed the one that will be named with him, John Paul II, in both instances I knew them and talked with them, and it was John Paul II who named me Archbishop of Hartford and gave me the pallium. You know, it makes one realize how close we can be to the saints. Growing up as a little boy, I heard of all the saints, and yet they seem to be off in the distance, ones that had lived in foreign countries and had then ultimately died and gone to heaven and were declared saints by the Church. In this instance here, however, to have known two of these saints personally, it makes one realize there's hope if one lives a proper life to be a saint in his own right, even though we may not be declared saints.
These are indeed saints for today, and that will be a very special day, I know, for you and for all of us. Well, Archbishop Cronin, we appreciate you being with us. Archbishop Daniel Cronin, the Archbishop Emeritus of Hartford. Thank you, and we'll be joining you in Rome for that very special day. Of course, John the 23rd was also known for his quick wit. Wyatt Spencer looks at the humorous side of this late pope.
John the 23rd's papacy lasted less than 5 years, but his brief time in office is full of stories.
When they asked him, well, how many people work in the Vatican? He said about half.
Father Richard D'Amelio, a professor at the Catholic University of America, describes Pope John as a man who related directly with people.
People liked him, I think. There was something about him that they liked. You know, if you like a person, you listen to them. And I think that's what it was. And then when you listen to him, he has something to say. His eyes twinkled. He had a good approach to life. He was joyful.
Not long after he was elected, John was walking the streets of Rome when he heard a woman call him fat. The Pope reportedly turned and said, "Madam, I trust you understand that the papal conclave is not exactly a beauty contest." Pope John also contemplated big issues, saying, "It often happens that I wake up at night and begin to think about a serious problem, and I decide I must tell the Pope about it. Then I wake up completely and remember that I am the Pope."
It's important for someone in my position to know when to keep quiet and when to talk, to speak the right amount, to speak with elegance, to speak with respect for all people.
Many say it was his humility that people were drawn to, saying anyone can be Pope, look at me. But perhaps he's best known for calling the Second Vatican Council. When Vatican officials told him it would be absolutely impossible to open the council by 1963, he said, "Fine, we'll open it in 1962. Sure enough, his honest approach and tongue-in-cheek responses are a few reasons he's still called Good Pope John. Wyatt Spencer, EWTN News Nightly.
Thanks a lot, Wyatt. John Paul II will be canonized along John the 23rd here at St. Peter's tomorrow. Many young priests and religious have made the pilgrimage to join in this great celebration. As Jason Calvi reports, it was the influence of John Paul II that encouraged many of them to follow their vocations.
Youthful joy robed in the 800-year-old Dominican habit. These sisters live in this dorm and serve as advisors to students. They're pursuing graduate degrees here at Catholic University of America.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
And they pray with students in a school chapel. These sisters grew up knowing only one pope.
I just can't believe that I was in the presence of a saint. I mean,
Before they joined the convent, Sister Teresa Christie and Sister Maria Frassati both saw JP2 in St. Louis back in 1999.
Christ is calling you, the church needs you, the Pope believes in you and expects great things of you. And I had a real sense of a calling when he said that.
John Paul II dared millions of young people to the adventure of a lifetime.
Father in heaven, your Son Jesus called us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world.
He was willing to trust
us with this mission of the church.
Here at the Blessed John Paul II Seminary, there's reminders of him filling many of the walls. Here's his papal coat of arms, and this item over here is one that John Paul II wore during the celebration of Holy Mass. And for many seminarians across the world, Pope John Paul II inspired them to look into the priesthood.
One who sees the world, identifies what is good and what it is bad, in individual human hearts and in the society at large, and is able to give them what they need in confidence and in joy.
Sister Maria Frassati hopes to share with her students what Blessed John Paul shared with her.
But this is something that they can do now, in the present moment, as they are, as young people, and that's a beautiful and compelling part of the life of the church.
And come April 27th, the sisters will not just call their mentor a father, but a saint. Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Good story, Jason. Thank you. Pilgrims from John Paul II's native Poland are flocking to Rome this weekend. At last count, about 1,700 busloads. Our Rome correspondent Alan Holdren visited a guest house for Poles that becomes so much more.
Santo subito, Italian for sainthood now. The desire of the people at John Paul II's death will become reality on April the 27th. Thousands of reminders of his legacy between gifts and writings are housed here. A guest house for Poles visiting Rome. A veritable museum to John Paul II. During his nearly 3-decade pontificate, the pilgrim pope traveled 104 times abroad, totaling more than 700,000 miles. These are the presents he received from every corner of the globe.
At first, the idea was to organize a pilgrim house, but shortly after the election, it became clear that the Pope had brought many gifts to Rome through his many world travels. Where could they be kept? The Vatican Museum was not interested because they were objects from the present. Therefore, a collection site was also supposed to be organized. Secondly, many books and articles had been printed in the world on the papal visits, his teachings, and his priorities, especially after the Pope's assassination attempt, which was particularly timely because it was the first time in the history of the Church. So those in charge wanted to find a place.
Alan Holdren, our EWTN News Nightly eyes and ears here at the Vatican year-round. Thanks a lot. I hope to visit that center before returning to Washington. Next week in Washington, Gilbert Levine, known as the Pope's Maestro, will conduct a special concert celebrating John Paul II, a man we will now call saint, a man he calls friend.
He knighted me, and I feel that I am, although I don't need to because the world doesn't need him defended, that I am carrying on that mission. I feel it as an enormously important part of what the gift that he gave me and the understanding of spirituality, of resonance that I would never have had if I didn't have the relationship with John Paul, and to think that millions, billions of people around the world share that veneration is incredible. This is not the end of this concert, it's the beginning. It is the beginning of our understanding of the gift that John Paul has given all of us on this earth. I thought it was also brilliant, actually, to canonize both John the 23rd and John Paul II together. They are saints for the world, because everyone, no matter what religion, no matter what background, will find in them people who are reaching out to embrace them. This concert is going to be free in the spirit of Francis. Everyone should come. This concert on May 5th to celebrate the canonizations of John Paul and John the 23rd will be free. Of course it will be free. That's great. In the age of Francis, of course it will be free.
Gilbert Levine, the Pope's Maestro. Well, the Swiss Guard is ever present here at the Vatican, and these young men can find themselves at any time face to face with the Holy Father. Wyatt Spencer visited a man who had that incredible experience during the early years of John Paul II's pontificate.
They're known as the Vatican Special Security Force. Far from an outdated tradition, these men are trained to protect the Pope and the Vatican, plus to serve as honor guards for visiting heads of state.
You know, the funny thing is I went into the guards because it was military. Because, you know, to be a bodyguard is the coolest thing you can think of, no?
Andreas Wittmer at the Catholic University of America knows the job well. He served under John Paul II from 1986 to 1988. As a young man in his early 20s, Wittmer had lots of chances to guard the Pope, shake his hand, and even talk to him.
The way I met John Paul II is in a sense more like a gentleman who I worked for rather than the Pope. I'm supposed to be the person he passes by and you don't really pay attention to. But of course, John Paul isn't like that. He pays attention.
At first, Wittmer wasn't focused on his Catholic faith, but over time, through those short encounters, he says he saw an example of kindness.
He impressed me so much as a human person, and he actually reached out to me. It was a special occasion, actually on a Christmas Eve, where I was in really bad shape emotionally, and he noticed. And he reached out to me and thanked me for my service and showed me true compassion.
Nowadays, Wittmer is part of a group that regularly gets special access in the Vatican to help train new Swiss guards. But on the days leading up to the canonizations, he says he'll be a pilgrim like everyone else, to stand in appreciation of a former boss, a friend, and a saint.
Thanks again, Wyatt. Well, whether you're president, prime minister, or pope, you need someone who knows you well enough to actually speak for you. Our Susie Pinto introduces us to just such a man, John Paul II's longtime spokesman.
As his press secretary, Joaquin Navarro-Valls traveled the world with John Paul II. The Pope, who will be made a saint in a few weeks, told him where that desire to travel came from.
He told me once when I asked him about his trips and why he insisted on them, he said, there was a time when the people came to meet the priest in the parish. Now the priest has to go out to the people. He thought of himself as a priest who was going out to meet the people, and that's why he traveled all over the world.
The medical doctor and journalist says the Polish Pope had a special relationship with the media.
It seemed as if God was being ignored in modern culture. But he got the media to focus on God. You could say the Pope worked with the media.
After more than 20 years as one of his closest aides, Navarro-Valls had the tough task of announcing the death of his beloved boss to the world's media.
The Holy Father, John Paul II, died this evening at 9:37. Viaticum was administered to the Holy Father, and once again, the sacrament of the sick.
We now know that John Paul II's private notes were not burned, as he had asked. Navarro-Valls says that was the right thing to do. And what did he think when he found out John Paul would be a saint?
My reaction was to tell him, once again, thank you, John Paul II, for the masterpiece that you made of your life, and that those of us who are close to you were able to see.
Thanks a lot, Susie. Coming up, more memories of John Paul II from Washington, D.C.'s Archbishop Emeritus, and how our two new saints displayed their devotion to St. Joseph. Watching a special Saturday edition of EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick in Rome for our Two Saints Forever coverage of the canonizations of Popes John XXIII and John Paul II. Did you know both popes had a special devotion to St. Joseph? More on that in a moment from Wyatt Spencer. But first, our Jason Calvi took an interesting look at the history of American presidents meeting with popes on the eve of the recent meeting between Pope Francis and President Obama here at the Vatican.
They laugh and give gifts. They talk.
Sir, how nice of you to receive me.
And pose for photos. The Pope gives an address, sometimes with a microphone, and sometimes standing. The First Ladies often wear the traditional black veil called a mantilla. And sometimes even the President helps with the Pope's clothes. President Woodrow Wilson was the first president to meet a Pope back in 1919. The next visit was 40 years later, in 1959. President Dwight Eisenhower met Pope John XXIII. JFK, the first and only Catholic president, met Pope Paul VI in 1963. Paul was the first pope to visit the United States. President LBJ was there in 1965. And in 1979, Blessed John Paul II made history with the first papal visit to the Carter White House. President Reagan and JP2 fought communism together. It was under Reagan that the U.S. and the Vatican set up formal diplomatic relations.
Very nice.
We honor you for helping to lead a revolution of values and spirit in Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, freeing millions to live by conscience.
President George W. Bush has the record with 6 papal meetings with Popes JP2 and Benedict.
I do care about the opinions of people, particularly someone as profound as the Holy Father.
Thank you so much.
And President Obama met Pope Benedict at the Vatican back in 2009. Come tomorrow, he'll become the second president to meet 2 popes.
Thanks, Jason. Now we flash back to a month or so ago to the Feast of St. Joseph, when Wyatt Spencer found a special connection between Popes John XXIII, John Paul II, and Pope Francis, who will preside over their canonization ceremony right here tomorrow.
With Blessed Joseph, her spouse.
It's a part of the Mass many people may not even notice, but the mention of Joseph in all the Eucharistic prayers gives Father John Filippelli a reason to smile.
We were so happy.
Filippelli is a Josephite, a religious order devoted to St. Joseph, and the first group to serve African-American seminarians in the U.S. For decades, Filippelli wrote about and supported a push to put Joseph into the Mass.
When people really respond to Joseph, pay attention to him and his life, the person that he was, the Church benefits from that.
During the Second Vatican Council, Pope John XXIII inserted the name Joseph in the first Eucharistic prayer. As 3 new Eucharistic prayers were added, they did not include Joseph's name. John XXIII's personal devotion to Joseph was complemented by Pope John Paul II, who wrote at length about Joseph's role in the life of the Church. But it wasn't until Pope Francis' decree last summer that Joseph was put in every Eucharistic prayer.
In the Gospel, St. Joseph appears as a strong and courageous man, a working man, yet in his heart we see great tenderness, which is not the virtue of the weak, but rather a sign of strength of spirit and a capacity for concern.
He always had kind of a silent role, and apparently St. Joseph was content with that. Kind of being the central focus being Christ himself.
Bishop John Ricard, rector of the Josephite Seminary, says Francis' addition is a step in the right direction and hopes all Christians will take the time to learn more about the life of St. Joseph.
Family life is very important, especially when you hear today the many stressors on family life. And St. Joseph, I think, represents someone who out of his way goes and protects Mary and his foster son, Jesus Christ, in so many ways.
And Wyatt, the Josephites are very hopeful Pope Francis will declare a year of St. Joseph, just as Benedict XVI proclaimed a year of St. Paul during his pontificate. Also there in D.C., Washington's Archbishop Emeritus Theodore McCarrick shared his fond memories of Blessed John Paul II with our Jason Calvi.
The most traveled pope in history, Blessed John Paul II visited 129 countries, including 7 visits to the United States. At his side in New Jersey back in 1995, the man in purple was then Newark Archbishop Theodore McCarrick.
It was wonderful. We had, in a teeming rain, we had 80,000 people in Giant Stadium, and they didn't make a move. They were so filled with enthusiasm.
After evening prayer inside the Newark Cathedral, Cardinal McCarrick felt the intense power of JP2's prayer.
He knelt there, and there was like a tent around him that you couldn't violate. I walked like 3 yards back. He knelt, and within 10 seconds, he wasn't with us. He was with the Lord. That depth of prayer I had never seen before.
The two first met in New York back in 1976. McCarrick joked about his vacation being cut short. The man who would become Pope remembered that joke for years.
He's holding my other hand so that I couldn't get away. And they said, "Did you ever get your vacation?" It was a man who never forgot people.
Up next, Jason visits an expanding John Paul II Seminary, and Cardinal Timothy Dolans shares his reflections on Two Saints Forever. From the Vatican, I'm Brian Patrick with the EWTN News Nightly team and this special Two Saints Forever coverage of the canonizations of Popes John Paul II and John the 23rd. We hear a lot about the shortage of priests, but a seminary named for John Paul II is bursting at its seams. Jason Calvi has this encouraging story from Washington. Jason?
Heavenly chants have filled Blessed John Paul II Seminary since late 2011. 29 men are training for the priesthood here in Washington. The problem? This place only has room for 30 seminarians. So now the building's been expanded with a new wing and an extra 20 bedrooms.
Somebody asked me who builds a seminary, and apparently we do. But one of the priests said, boy, this is really a bold venture today, really one that takes a lot of vision, a lot of trust in God.
Your mercy, O Lord, sustains me.
Matthew Norwood came to the seminary from George Washington University. He's now a college sophomore living here and studying at Catholic University of America.
It's just a really incredible thing to reflect upon. The fact that this house is full, it's full of a great spirit, and that we have this chance to move into this new wing and really continue that growth.
Growth through a life of prayer,
Amen,
and study. To help, the men have this new library.
Some of the men said they feel smarter just coming into the room, which I don't know that that's the case.
There's this new recreation room to relax after a long day of studying.
So they could gather and build bonds of fraternity.
They also have an expanded classroom and a new exercise area.
I think all of us like the gym. It's about twice the size of what it used to be.
These men are either college students, or for those who already graduated, they study philosophy and languages. It's the first step before they go on to a different seminary for 4 more years of graduate-level theology.
But they are there. God is calling men, and this is a witness that we had a need.
And one more big change on the horizon is the name and the signs of this place, because come April 27th, it won't be Blessed John Paul, but St. John Paul. Reporting here in Washington, I'm Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Very timely, Jason, as we celebrate John Paul's sainthood. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this EWTN News Nightly special. Churches across Rome tonight will be open for all-night vigils, and we'll be there. I'll join Raymond Arroyo in the morning from right here to share that experience as we celebrate our 2 new saints on Divine Mercy Sunday here in Rome. For our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. We leave you now with these reflections from Cardinal Timothy Dolan.
It's an exuberant time in the life of the Church, isn't it, everybody? With the canonization by Pope Francis of Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II. The whole world is rejoicing. I personally feel an immense sense of joy and gratitude for this providential occasion in the life of the Church, because I remember both those popes very, very well. I was only 8 when Pope John the 23rd was elected, 1958, and then I was only 13 when he died 4.5 years later. But he had a great impact on my life. I can remember, even as a child, how lovable, how approachable, how humble he was. I could remember how he touched the heart of the world. I can remember in the editorial cartoon when I was growing up in St. Louis on the day after he died, that had a picture of the globe with the face of a man crying. That's how he touched the heart of the world. John Paul II, hallelujah. I had a box seat on his pontificate because I was able to be in Rome from 1994 to 2001 as rector of the North American College in Rome and see him in action. John Paul II won the Lou Gehrig record of beatifying and canonizing saints. A reporter asked me, don't you think John Paul II is overdoing it? Don't you think he's terribly impractical to imply that all of us can be saints? And I said just the opposite. He's reminding us of the universal call to holiness. He's reminding us that sanctity, with the grace and mercy of God, is possible. Virtue, perfection, heroic sanctity, they're possible with God's grace and mercy. We're called to do it too. And now to think that this man who inspired the world is now being raised to the altar. This to me is an answer to prayers. This to me is using the classroom of the church. God bless Pope Francis, the classroom of the church, to teach the world, to model their lives, our lives, on these two great popes, St. John the 23rd, St. John Paul II. Does that ever feel good to be able to call them saint?